Hello, it's Dr. DeBord again. I hope you're doing okay. I'm here to talk about operant conditioning for a brief time today. In comparison to classical conditioning, operant conditioning is based on voluntary behavior. The very first psychologist who basically named some of the principles involved with this came up with what was called the law of effect. And this is really simple. Basically, if you have good consequences following your actions, you're going to do it again. If bad consequences follow your actions, you're not going to do that again. That's the basis of it. That's called the law of effect. And that is really what operant conditioning is based upon. Another famous psychologist by the name of Skinner further broke down the terms that work in operant conditioning, kind of like what we saw happen in classical conditioning, where we can see this basic reflex and association learning broken down into small bits, and then we could name it unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. With operant conditioning, we have this law of effect. If good things happen, you'll do it again. Bad things happen, you won't. But then we start to break it down further into positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment. So that's where I want to go next. So reinforcement and punishment, that's the first distinction. Just like we had with the last model of learning, classical conditioning, where you could ask yourself two questions. On the test that's coming up Friday, you can ask yourself a series of questions in regards to the application questions I'll be asking you. You can ask yourself, is he giving me an example here where the behavior increases or decreases? And so if the behavior increases or is made stronger or more likely, then we're talking about reinforcement. If the behavior you're talking about decreases, then we're going to call that punishment. That's the first question. The second question is only in relation to reinforcement. I know in the study guide that I originally gave you, I asked you to know the difference between between positive punishment and negative punishment, but I decided to get rid of that distinction because in everyday life, it's just not used. So I'm going to ask you to know the difference between reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement, basically, you increase the behavior. Punishment decreases behavior. But then when it comes to reinforcement, you can have two other options. Positive reinforcement is when you give something to the learner, so they're going to do it more often. Negative reinforcement is more difficult. So let me go down. So in very simple terms, if you have a child and they're in school and you say, okay, for every A you get on your report card, you get $10. If that actually increases the number of A's your child gets, then you've effectively used positive reinforcement because you've given them something and they've increased their behavior. Negative reinforcement is a little different. So I have several examples on this slide here. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but we'll talk about, I know that we've talked about phobias before. If a person has a phobia of, let's say, dogs, and if they're walking down the street and they see a dog that's not on a chain, they're probably going to avoid walking down that street. When they avoid walking down that street, their anxiety goes down, and that takes away something aversive. It takes away an unpleasant situation. So what's happened here is you've taken something away and increases the likelihood that avoidance will happen again. So that's called negative reinforcement because the behavior increases, avoidance increases, and something unpleasant was taken away. So let me go back up here to these two terms. We have positive reinforcement is when you give something. You give a kid a cookie and they clean their room, and they clean the room, you give them a cookie and they do it again. That's easy. That's positive reinforcement. Punishment. You have a child runs down the street, you give them a whooping, they stop running out in the street. That's punishment. That's simple. Negative reinforcement is probably the most difficult part of this whole model of learning. You have to typically think about something that is unpleasant and that being taken away. And I guess most people could relate to anxiety being a common, consistent, unpleasant state for many people, and that anything that takes that away is going to result in that person doing that again. So the second example I have up here is alcohol as a stress reliever. If someone is an alcoholic and they're really stressed, they have that stress going on, and then they drink whatever they drink. If that takes away their stress, that increases the likelihood they're going to drink that alcohol more in the future. Actually, what we know about in terms of models of alcoholism is a person who drinks for stress relief instead of drinking alcohol as a way to enjoy oneself, they're going to have more problems with alcohol dependence. So anything that results in a stress reliever, if someone exercises and it takes away the tension in their body, they're going to find that to be rewarding, basically. So they're going to exercise more because it takes away the stress in their body. That is negative reinforcement. All these examples I have here are examples of negative reinforcement. Another example, when you get in the car and you start it up, if you don't put on your seatbelt, the car manufacturer has made that annoying noise, that ding, 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 whatever, go on. They do that on purpose. They do that so that you'll buckle your seatbelt. So when you buckle your seatbelt, it takes away that annoying noise. And so effectively, they've used negative reinforcement. You're increasing your seatbelt buckling behavior because it takes away the noise. And so you're more likely to do it again in the future. Again, the question is the behavior increasing or is it decreasing? If it's increasing, then that's reinforcement. Then the next question you should ask yourself, was something being given or something being taken away? Now, when something's being given, usually someone's being given something that's pleasant, nice, cookies, food, praise, those sorts of things. Those are positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is when you take away something that is unpleasant that's already in the environment. I put up here, if you have a headache, you have an ongoing headache, most people take Advil or aspirin or something like that. It takes away the headache. If it successfully gets rid of your headache, what are you going to do next time you get a headache? You're going to take Advil. You're going to take an aspirin. So those are some of the basics examples of negative reinforcement that I can provide. I guess the other one that I could talk about is when we get there, we'll get to the disorders chapter in a few weeks, obsessive compulsive behavior. So a person who obsessively washes their hands because they think they're contaminated, they have germs. So what happens is when a person has OCD, hand washing is a common compulsive behavior. What happens is a person will think, oh, my hands are contaminated, and this is our time of the coronavirus, people are washing their hands all the time. So they're like, I've been contaminated. And so their anxiety gets really high. So what happens, if they wash their hands, that will take the anxiety away. But that increases the likelihood they're going to wash their hands the next time they feel that anxiety. And with a person with obsessive compulsive disorder, they can wash their hands as many as like 50 or 80 times a day, so much so that their hands get cracked and bloody. It's gross. But that works on the process of negative reinforcement. A person feels like they've been contaminated, their anxiety is high, they wash their hands, it takes away the anxiety. You take something away, it increases the likelihood they're going to wash their hands in the future. That's the definition of negative reinforcement. So these are the questions you ask yourself. What is the behavior? Is it increasing or decreasing? If the behavior increases, it's reinforcement. If the behavior decreases, it's punishment. So I know that I already said giving a whooping is the most common kind of type of punishment, but anything that decreases the behavior, we're just going to call that punishment, period. So you take away a teenager's cell phone because they violated curfew, and then they stop violating curfew, then you've successfully used punishment because they decreased their behavior. Let's see. The next question you ask in terms of reinforcement was something being given, something being taken away. If something's given, it's a positive reinforcement. If something's being taken away, it's negative reinforcement. Let's see. Two additional terms that I'd like you to know about are the types of reinforcements when we have positive reinforcements. Basically, anything that affects the body directly. And I have up here for primary reinforcements, food, water, sex, comfort, affection. Those things affect a person an animal's body just directly. Those are called primary. It's kind of like primary school are the basic grades. Those are the things that are called primary reinforcements. Anything else is secondary. So when I have up here the dollar sign, I mean, if you think about going to school, I mean, getting good grades is a secondary reinforcement. Because you get good grades, then hopefully you can get a diploma. Diploma is a secondary reinforcement. Hopefully diploma will get you a job. If you get a job and you go to it and do it well, you'll get paid. Money, that's a secondary reinforcement. Because that's going to get you the stuff here that affects your body directly. Food, it's going to buy, you buy groceries, you get a home, so you got security, safety, water, and hopefully a relationship where you have comfort, sex, and affection. All right, one other term in terms of reinforcement is called shaping. That is where you give positive reinforcements for small steps towards the behavior you ultimately want to see happen. So if you have a child and you want them to clean their room every day at the end of the day, you could start small. You could say, okay, pick up your toys and you get a cookie. And so for that first week, the child picks up the toys, and every time they do, they get a cookie. Say, okay, pick up your toys and then hang up all your clothes, and then you'll get the reward. Then you get a cookie. And so they have to do that. Then you say for the third week, okay, pick up your toys, hang up your clothes, and run the vacuum cleaner in here every day. I mean, eventually, that you're shaping their behavior so you get a clean room. That's the ultimately desired behavior you want, and you're reinforcing every small step. In the final week, you could say, okay, pick up your toys, hang up your clothes, run the vacuum cleaner, Windex the windows, make your bed, however draconian you want to get with having your child clean the room. But that's called shaping. One thing about punishment, more than one thing, 4 things about punishment. It's a lot harder to use because you have to be vigilant. Y'all know when you're little kids. Me and my twin sister used to get in trouble for eating Oreos before dinner. Eating anything like that because it's ruined supper. But what we realized, we get punished if we got caught trying to sneak some cookies. But if my mom was on the phone, we realized she wasn't paying attention, and you could get away with getting some cookies. And that's the thing. If you use punishment, you're going to have your learner typically look for, when can I get away with this behavior? And if the teacher, the parent, whoever's driving this learning situation, if they're not vigilant, you're going to have the learner look for ways to get away with the behavior that's not desired. So it takes a vigilance and immediate action. One example of this I have is I had a friend, I'm not a big fan of this thing, but he had a dog who just barked its full head off every time he knocked on the door. And he bought the dog a shock collar. And I don't agree with those. But what happened was every time the dog's bark would reach a certain volume, it would give it a shock around the neck. So the next time I went to my friend's door and knocked on the door, this was the weirdest thing. The dog had learned to whisper. It was going, "Arf, arf, arf." It's like the dog figured out if it just barked at that volume instead of that volume, it wouldn't activate the shock. And even the dog learned, I can get away with this behavior if I do it like that. So for punishment to work, it's just got to be consistent. It's got to be every time. Also, punishment just models aggressive behavior. You're basically saying, when you have problems, be aggressive. And it doesn't tell the learner, whether it's a dog or whether it's a kid, what they're supposed to do. Sometimes, if punishment is the only thing that's used, you get scared kids, you get scared animals, they just shut down and don't do anything. That's not what you want. You want kids and animals to play and be curious. So these points about punishment I want to ask you about on the test on Friday. So study those. I think this is the last thing. No, 2 more things I want to talk about. Schedules of reinforcement. If you're using positive reinforcement, one way to get somebody to learn something is to continually reinforce every single time they do the behavior. But there are also examples of partial reinforcement. Partial reinforcement makes a lot more sense, where you don't reinforce every single time the behavior happens, because if you do a continuous reinforcement, as soon as you stop giving the reinforcement, the person's going to stop doing the behavior. if you look at how the world works, typically what happens is that people are going to be they're going to be given a reinforcement every once in a while. And that will make them want to continue that behavior longer. I think the most common example for this is like a slot machine. If you've ever gambled at the casinos and realize that people sit there and they put their quarters into the slot machines or whatever they got, now they push the credit card in and push a button. But if they were reinforced every single time and then suddenly the slot machine stopped, they would stop paying money to gamble. But the way the slot machines work is they provide partial reinforcement. Sometimes they give a jackpot every 18th time, and then, or not every, an 18th time, and then after 2, and then after 37, and then after 16. And that sort of partial reinforcement keeps people at those slot machines for hours and hours and hours spending their money. And it's a powerful form of reinforcement to do it a partial way. Now, I know your book goes on further to elaborate on different types of partial reinforcement. I'm not asking to know those different forms. It's a little bit more complicated, actually. Last thing is, you probably heard about this, step on a crack, break your mother's back. If you have any superstitious behaviors at all, usually that has happened because you've engaged in a behavior and it was accidentally reinforced. So if you happen to use a certain pencil when you took a test and you got like 100%, and you basically think like, oh, it's because I used my lucky pencil. It had nothing to do with your pencil. It had to do with whether you studied or not. So you can get behaviors that get accidentally reinforced and people do those things again. A lot of athletes end up falling prey to this. I don't know if you're into baseball or anything like that, but a lot of times baseball players will go through rituals when they come up to the plate to swing, and they'll touch the corner of their plate with the baseball bat, and they'll touch their hands on their pants, and they'll do these just sometimes sophisticated rituals because the last time they did that, they scored a home run or they got on base. That's going to make a difference. But it has nothing to do with those behaviors. It has to do with how good a hitter they are. But people get accidentally reinforced and they keep doing those behaviors. That's where superstitious behaviors come from. That's all I have for you today. I hope this has been helpful. As I mentioned on the email I sent earlier today, there will be no video for observational learning. It is very simple. I may post a YouTube video based on Bandura's famous experiment though. Okay, take care.